Let's go to the podium where Mr. Beasley is about to speak.
I enjoyed most of that. Bringing back that political stuff, though, is like almost getting put in jail. You know, one thing I can say about my tenure in politics, the 32 days that I served as governor, the best days the state has ever had. And the reason is, Mayor, I did absolutely nothing. I do appreciate Dr. Harris' introduction, and I appreciate very much the opportunity to come and speak. I was asked to talk about some of the litigation that we have handled that affects the entire state of Alabama, and we think probably affects more than just Alabama. I'm in a profession that a lot of folks really don't understand. In fact, I told my wife, I said, I don't really understand it. I said, everybody I talk to and deal with loves you. And I said, most of them don't like me. She said, a few do. And, you know, I'm a trial lawyer, and that's what I do for a living. I'm not ashamed of it. I enjoy it. I see the need for lawyers that do what I do. I also see need for lawyers on the other side of the coin. I'm going to talk about some of the litigation that we've handled, some involving the state of Alabama. One case that we are involved in heavily right now is the BP oil litigation, and a lot of people don't realize in the business community, every business in Alabama has a potential claim, and unless you have explored that, that is under the settlement that we worked out with BP. Under the terms of the settlement, every business in Alabama has a potential claim. So if nothing else from this talk, if you're in the business world, check it out and find out if in fact what the amount of your claim is, because every business will likely have a claim. Everybody has a potential claim, and we know it because we helped engineer the settlement. Right now we have 47 employees, including lawyers, dedicated to the BP litigation. We represent right now approximately 4,000 individual clients, many of them business owners. For example, one of the clients is a brokerage house in Chicago, one of the largest seafood brokerage houses in the country in Chicago, Illinois. They were buying all of their seafood out of the Gulf. Now, I'm going to tell you this, and write this down in your member book. This business is not over yet, even though the settlement was reached, and I'm going to give you one little bit of warning. BP put in the Gulf, in addition to the volumes of oil that flowed out of that well, a chemical, Coexit, that is banned in Great Britain because it causes cancer. And they dumped over 200, I've forgotten how many thousands of gallons of this into the Gulf, and for the first time they shot it to the bottom. So now you've got layers of chemical and oil that if we had a hurricane, we got big time problems if it stirs it up in the Gulf. You hadn't heard much about it. You hadn't really seen much about it in the media because it has not been reported. Give you an example of how BP operated in that field. In the first year, they spent over $200 million on television ads alone telling you how great they are and how wonderful they are and how they've caused the problem. And they are great at PR. Other than that, pretty sorry outfit, quite frankly, insofar as how they operate. Now, let me just tell you real quick about the settlement. We worked the settlement out confidentially and privately. In fact, nobody even knew the negotiations were taking place, and we had a person on the negotiating team, and the settlement will affect every business, every individual that has a claim. It is now a class action, and everybody will be compensated adequately, and we think in a very good fashion. Now, there are other claims that are still out there. For example, the state of Alabama has a claim, all the states on the coast, and the federal government has a separate claim. And we're talking about on the federal claim, probably fines will amount to about $20 billion, maybe a little bit more. And right now, if you don't do anything else, talk to your members of Congress, because they have not done what they need to do, and that is to change the law where the Gulf Coast states will get at least 80% of the money that comes into that part of the settlement. And it will settle, because I'm going to say this without any reservation. BP cannot afford to go to trial because they were so bad that really somebody should have been prosecuted criminally on what they did in the Gulf. We have memos, for example, where engineers exchanged information saying that we are running a risk, and the risk is great, and if what happens that we project could happen, it will do exactly what did happen, and that's in writing. And I'll answer any questions you might have on the BP litigation. I'm going to try to hurry through what I was asked to talk about. The second thing, and this is one that has been under the radar, and that's the AWP litigation. We call it D. Miles, who's here today in our firm, heads up the team in our law firm that's been involved in the AWP litigation. Let me ask you, first of all, when I say AWP litigation, how many of you know what I'm talking about? I'm not trying to embarrass anybody, but just for my information. Does anybody know? I don't call it that. I call it the Medicaid drug fraud litigation. Because, give you an example. The drug companies got together, came up with a scheme to cheat the state of Alabama and every state that has a Medicaid program by overcharging for the drugs. And here's what they said in writing, in memos that we got in the litigation after we were hired by the state to file the lawsuit. We have memos that say, for example, that the state of Alabama is unsophisticated, they don't understand what they're dealing with, we'll be able to get away with it, we won't get caught, and this type thing. And one of them said, let's make hay while the sun shines, get all we can get. So what they were doing, they operate on what they call an average wholesale price when they price the drugs. They cheated the state of Alabama out of $1 billion plus. Now that's money out of the taxpayers' pockets in this state. Now, would you believe that Congress passed a law? And if you don't think these folks are not powerful politically, you're in a different world. Congress passed a law that said that if the federal government finds out anything that they're doing illegally, they cannot convey that information to any state Medicaid agency. Can you believe that? That is the law. In other words, the feds can know that the companies were cheating. They could not notify the states. And that's, I think, rather unique in our legal system. Now, let's talk about the cases. We tried 3 cases, in fact, let me tell you how it worked. While we were trying the cases, they being the drug companies, they brought lawyers from all over the country. The first case we tried, they had 100 lawyers sitting out in the audience in Judge Price's courtroom watching the proceedings, trying to find out exactly how we were going to try these cases. We now represent 8 states. But one thing sort of comical happened during that first trial. Somehow or another, I got on their email chain, all the defense lawyers, and it put me in sort of a dilemma ethically. The first night after we started the trial, I get this email. It says, we got to regroup, folks. It said, this judge is not as dumb as we thought. And I'm paraphrasing it. They said, we came down here thinking we were going to hoodwink this fella, and said, he's smart. And said, and Beasley ain't bad. And I'm paraphrasing that too. And so I told him the next morning, I saw one of the local guys who did not offer that. I said, I don't think I'm too offended about this, but I think if Judge Price heard what you said about him, and I didn't say it all, I said, he probably would be offended. So they took me off the chain. So anyway, we tried 3 cases, and what were the verdicts? $278 million, is that ballpark figure? 275. Think about that now. Juries in Montgomery County returned verdicts for the state, $275 million. Supreme Court of Alabama reversed those verdicts, said there was no fraud involved. We represent 8 states right now. We have settled, we have not lost a single case in a single state. Supreme Courts have actually ruled, got one ruling this week out of what, Utah, is that correct? We have settled cases already that we can talk about of over $600 million for the other states. That ought to tell you something. It ought to make you wonder. How could Alabama allow cheating to be okay and all these other states say it's not? Right now, we do have one case on appeal that's been up there for 2 years, $88 million, that we believe is perhaps has a chance to be affirmed. And we're talking about a state of Alabama, folks, that is flat broke. And that's another story. In fact, I wish I could, y'all didn't tell me to talk about that, but I may talk about it a little bit anyway. How many of you think, let me ask y'all a question. Y'all will get a chance to question me in a few minutes. How many of you believe in your hearts that Alabama has made public education the top priority for the state of Alabama? Raise your hand if you believe that. You are absolutely 100% correct. In fact, Alabama has never made public education the top priority. We've never had our priorities in the education field set like they should be. I'm going to tell you one thing I did that I've never gotten credit for, and I ain't trying to get credit for it now because I'm not running for anything. Wouldn't run if you put a gun to my head. But back in 1971, I, along with several others, went to South Carolina and literally stole their industrial training program. He came back to Alabama, and this man never got any credit for what he did. Dr. T.L. Faulkner, who was with the vocational department, state of Alabama, Jimmy Clark, the House Speaker, he was then in the Senate, and there were about 5 of us. We came back and we put this program in. Now, education folks really didn't understand the Alabama Industrial Development Training Program. Does everybody here know what I'm talking about? They didn't understand it because it didn't have a building. And the way it worked, you would actually train employees. You would have people who were employed, and you'd upgrade them by training them on the very machine that they were going to be working on in the plant as the plant was being built. And it would be maybe in a high school gym, maybe in an old abandoned building, and the program got off the bat. The first one that used it was Neptune Meters over in Tallahassee, and that was number 1. Since then, every industrial prospect that's come to Alabama has taken advantage of this program. But folks did not understand it. In fact, we had to force the money into the budget even to get it off the ground. And it worked, and it gives you some idea that oftentimes you've got to get outside the normal thinking, even in education, to make things happen. But back to, I'm getting off my subject, Dr. Harris, but you probably caused this by talking about politics. This last legislative session, I'd hate to know that I went down in history as a legislator that passed that immigration bill. We had gotten away from a lot of the problems of the past, the Bull Connor days, the whatever. And now we pass a law that is absolutely, in my opinion, one of the worst things the state of Alabama could have done. We do not need that image. We do not need it. And I will say this, you can play politics just so long with any issue. And we've seen that in this state, and we've seen the results of it and the consequences. We do not, first of all, we can't afford what the immigration law requires of the state and the political subdivision. Cannot afford it. The federal government has probably done a much better job in this field than we've given them credit for, but that's a federal issue, and it ought to be handled by the federal government. And I won't get into personalities, but I will mention that guy Scott Beeson. He reminds me so much of what we try to forget in this state and yet get away from, and that is absolutely true. Now, John Knight is here and came up a while ago and we had a little conversation. John was in charge of a very important legislative committee, and that is the Money Committee in the House of Representatives. I believe if you ask John Knight, he will tell you that we cannot keep patching and borrowing and not facing the issues that we have in this state. We need some revenue in Alabama. We need it on a permanent basis, and we don't need to keep borrowing from Peter to play Paul and take this approach of patch here, patch there. We're on the verge of collapse, and the folks in government have got to realize that. And now we're putting a vote out in September that people will be forced to vote for, and you're taking money out of a trust fund that we already owe how much? How much do we owe now on that trust fund? Bill, Fuller ought to know this. I think Governor Riley borrowed something like $385 million, $485 million that's got to be paid back, I think, next year. And on top of that, now we're taking more money out. Anyway, back to litigation. We ought to be. Quit talking about politics. On the AWP litigation, how many of you read this report? Did anybody in here get this thing? We put this out every month, and right now, I hate to tell Tom Mefford, who runs our law firm, how many folks are getting it. We send it free. We send out 45,000 hard copies per month all over the country, a lot of them in Alabama. If you take the time to read through here, you'll get a little idea of some people in the corporate world, some of the mindset of some of the huge corporations, and you'll see that in dealing with federal programs, a lot of them think it's okay to cheat the federal government, say in the Medicaid program and all kind of other programs. Every month we set out a few cases just to give you some idea. Here's the way it works. They cheat, they get caught, they pay the fine, and keep right on contracting with the government. Now, does that make sense? Maybe one time get caught and give them a second chance. But if you get caught 2, 3, 4 times, you ought to be taken off the rolls as a prospective bidder for a federal contract. But every month, we're talking about $200 million settlements, $500 million settlements. They have wised up a little bit, though. Here's what they do now. For example, this settlement with the banks did very little for the victims, the foreclosure victims, very, very little monetary compensation. What they did, they gave all the states a little bit of money, sort of dribble it out over time, and that makes everybody happy on the political level. But it does absolutely nothing for the victims. For example, we've handled a great number of cases where false appraisals were manufactured by the lenders, where they took advantage of folks, took their houses, and that is all over the country. And that's what this settlement was all about. You would think a settlement like that would benefit the victims, but it did not benefit the victims. In fact, you ought to really check that one out pretty carefully. And I've been a little bit surprised that nobody's done that. Now, I'm going to mention one thing. I'm going to ask you another question. I get a chance to ask you all questions before you get a chance to ask me. How many of you, if I said the Citizens United Supreme Court decision, how many of you know what that decision did? Second question. How many of you believe that a corporation is a person that has constitutional rights? Anybody believe that? I'm sorry? Yeah, that's what the Supreme Court said. I don't think that's what the founders of the Constitution thought. In fact, I've always thought a corporation was a corporation owned by shareholders. But now, here's the effect of that decision. In the political arena today, you're going to see more money spent in not just the presidential race. You're going to see it spent in congressional races, House and Senate. You're going to have more. For example, when one man can write a check now for $10 million and say that 50 million more coming, we're way, way out of bounds. But in this situation, now that they've made that ruling, money could be coming into the super PACs from Iran, from China, from India, anywhere, and nobody's going to know it. There'll be no disclosure. You'll have more money spent this year than ever before. Now, I think we've got to change that. And it's got to be changed. If we don't change the effect of Citizens United, the average citizen in this country will have absolutely no say-so in politics any longer. Don't have much now. But we need, our democracy depends on, as far as political stuff, full disclosure, where the money comes from, where it goes, how it's being spent. We don't have that today, folks. And I think it's a terrible mistake. I don't generally criticize the courts because I have to deal with them all the time, but I really have difficulty with that decision. I don't understand it, a 5-4 decision, and don't see it being changed anytime soon. Now, before I open it for questions, I see the political leadership of our area sitting right before me today. We have a mayor who has a vision. We have a chairman of the county commission who has a vision, and that vision is good for us. We see more good things happening in our area today because of this type of leadership. I hope everybody appreciates that because it's extremely important. This type meeting is extremely important, regardless who the speaker is. You can survive any speaker, but getting folks together, sitting down and talking about common interests, about common problems, about common solutions, and then talking to the politicians. And I'm glad to see that we have politicians here who understand that you've got to have a vision that includes everybody, and that everybody has got to be folks like who are in this room today. Can I tell you one more thing about drugs, and I'm going to hush and let you ask questions. Get you out of here on time. And by the way, I get up at 5 o'clock every morning, so I'm into the brunch time instead of breakfast time. How many of you believe that when I say FDA, the federal agency that's supposed to control the drug industry, the pharmaceutical manufacturers, how many of you believe that the FDA tests drugs before they go on the market? Does anybody believe that? Do you realize that the FDA has to rely on the testing that the pharmaceutical folks give them in making decisions? How many of you know what the fast-track approach to drug is being put on the market? Do you know what that is, the fast-track deal? That's where you have limited testing, you know. Now, it used to be that you'd have fast-track approach only in life-threatening maladies. It said you can get on the fast track, I'm paraphrasing it, you can get on the fast track if the drug is deals with a life-threatening malady. The somewhat powerful drug industry got Congress to make a very simple change. It now says fast track is allowed for life-threatening or serious maladies. That's where your painkillers come in. How many of you took Vioxx? Anybody? Vioxx. We settled the Vioxx case in federal court for what, 3.7 billion or 4.5 billion? It was 4.8 billion. When you get into billion, I have difficulty saying billion, but we settled nationally the Vioxx litigation for almost $5 billion. Andy Birchfield in our firm was selected by the federal judge in New Orleans as one of the leaders in that litigation. Give you an idea how it came about. First of all, Vioxx caused heart attacks and strokes. Not something you want to take voluntarily. You would think that they had adequately tested this drug before they put it on the market, wouldn't you? No, they didn't. In fact, when they found out it caused heart attack and strokes, they quit testing it. You would think that certainly the FDA would know that and wouldn't put it on the market, but that's not true. It went on the market, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people were killed, died, and their family members didn't have a clue why. Vioxx was a major disaster, but without the court system, they would have gotten away with it because the FDA had done absolutely nothing about it. Now, you would think that when you get a drug, it's got on there warnings. You know what I'm talking about on the label? They call it the label warnings. You're supposed to get everything bad about it, you're supposed to know. You would think that the FDA would have the authority to say what goes in the label, wouldn't you? This lady knows. The FDA does not have authority to make the label say anything. They negotiate it out with the drug companies, and ultimately the drug companies decide what the warnings are going to be. That's why you didn't get any warnings in vials. So that's why you got to have the court system, folks. Right now, we represent Governor Bentley in the BP litigation. We were hired by the state. And we have seen internally, let me just say one thing about Governor Riley. I want the media to find out where that fellow who used to be in charge of, he was called the Ombudsman for the state of Alabama, supposed to be coordinating all of the claims, the BP claims for the state. I want some of you media folks to find out where that guy's working today. Anybody got any ideas? How many folks in here make $600,000 a year? Raise your hand. And if anybody in my firm is making that, I'm going to check them out. I want the media to find out where that fellow's, what his qualifications are, if in fact he may be working for BP. I don't know that's true, but if he is, it makes me kind of wonder why. Anybody think that's an interesting coincidence, if it's true? We've learned a lot about how they operate, and they know how to do the PR. They know how to get around the government. When Dick Cheney became vice president, his crowd took over the agency that's supposed to regulate the oil companies. And when that happened, folks, it was over from regulation. So now you get your chance to ask me some questions if you want to, and if you don't, I'll be happy to leave you.